Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Merrow. Mary Zicafoose is an Ikat artist and weaving teacher located in Cedar Bluffs, Nebraska. Well, Mary Zicafoose, thank you for joining me. Now, you are the author of a book on Ikat, and I know that you teach about Ikat a lot. Can you tell me what exactly is Ikat?
Yes, I can tell you exactly what is Ikat. And it's not to be confused with shibori. I think we all know shibori, which is when we take woven cloth and fold and wrap and clamp it and dye it and create wonderful resist patterns. And Ikat is actually taking individual threads and doing the same thing. It's an old classic cultural resist dye technique that was kind of relegated and saved for the garments of the highest prestige because it's really time consuming, it's very labor intensive, but the results are incredibly smashing and beautiful. And so, when you put all that together, you have a pretty irresistible package for making fabulous cloth.
Well, and the word Ikat is from a particular place, but the technique is very
it's very widespread,
Yeah.
and I often wonder, so how do ideas get disseminated around the world? I mean, is there an idea hovering over the planet and then it just kind of sprinkles down universally across the planet in given locations at certain times, and somebody goes, hey, I think I'm going to wrap some fiber and dye it and unwrap it and weave it. Somebody says that in Egypt. Somebody says that in Indonesia. Somebody says that in Russia. And all of a sudden, the world is doing Ikat. I mean, I don't think it's that simple, but I kind of think it is that simple. And of course, we have the Silk Road and trade routes that carry these parcels of exotic fabric from camel to port, from port to ship, from ship to exotic location. And, that's how things spread. It wasn't Instagram. But it was Instagram by camel.
Yeah. And there are so many interesting regionally specific looks to it as well. I mean, what you see in, say, Uzbekistan and what you see in India are so different, and they're the same, idea of resist
it's
and
the
weave.
same, and the same with all of our weaving techniques. I mean, we all have the same, we all speak the same language. We have the same tools. You can only do so many things with threads going on top and under each other, but the vernacular of it is so incredibly different based on the sensibilities of a culture. And I just gave a talk the other night to a Weavers Guild, a Zoom talk, and we were talking about Ikats from Uzbekistan and the Stan countries. And those are countries that were such incredible decorators. Every building is decorated to the hilt. These are countries where people did incredible tile work and incredible brickwork. And we looked at all of these images of just embellishment upon embellishment upon embellishment. So, of course, when you see these Ikat robes, they resemble the buildings. That was the look. That was the language these people spoke. When you go to Asia and they're blue and white, they're really simple and they're blue and white, but meticulously done, meticulously done. So it's whatever everybody agrees to is the in thing. That's what arose from different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And I love the differences. And it all boils down to the same amount of work, no matter where you live.
That's true. I actually have a piece of silk velvet ikat, which I feel particularly attached to from
Ah,
Uzbekistan. True confession, I don't really understand how velvet is made, and it's okay, we don't have to go into that here, but it seems like just an extra layer of
oh, it
complexity.
is. It is. It's like, oh, let's even make it harder. Let's make it velvet. But that's the human. That's
Yeah,
what we do. It's like we can't hold ourselves back.
that's true. Now, I mostly know of you as, somebody who writes books that we consider to be weaving books and teaches at conferences that we consider to be weaving conferences. But do you think of yourself as a weaver or a dyer, or are they really kind of connected and impossible to parse apart?
I will tell you, I'm gonna wind it back one step farther. I think
Oh, please.
I consider myself an artist,
Okay.
and that's like the big umbrella,
hmm
and then the sub umbrella under that is I call myself an Ikat tapestry weaver.
Oh.
And,
hmm
because primarily the Ikat work I do is in tapestry. It's not wearables. I'm not making Uzbek robes.
hmm Right.
But in order to teach Ikat, I realized that there are very few. The tapestry weaving community is small. And the
Right.
Ikat tapestry weavers, there may be two of us on the planet, So
Right.
to write a book on Ikat tapestry was like, I don't know if that's the way to go. But so I introduced Ikat through the hand of the functional wearable
hmm
world. So that would be scarves and stoles and
hmm
tableware. And that's the way to learn Ikat. First of all, warp Ikat is far less complex, far
hmm
easier to learn than weft Ikat. And
Hmm.
all of those items are warp Ikat. The Ikat we all know and love is warp Ikat. And so let's teach warp Ikat. So that was why I wrote a book on warp Ikat, even though I rarely do
Oh, that's so interesting.
it. Yeah.
When I had first had someone explain Guatemalan jaspe to me, now, and that's something that's the patterning is often done in two directions. And she found it easier to explain to me how to do the weft-wise one, even though the warp-wise one was easier to do, but it was easier to explain how the
How
pattern
to
would
do
be
the
established.
weft.
Yeah.
And I think with weft, of course, with weft ikat, depending on what your use is going to be, if you're doing it with a tapestry or a rug, those
hmm
salvages have to look like God wove them. And you
Right.
can't have a bunch of extra hanging off the edges. But if it's going to be a wearable garment, you can just cut that, and that can be a seam allowance there. So
Right.
it's a whole different application with finer threads and with wearables.
hmm
And there is
Yeah.
smashing no matter what the application is. I really am a devotee of Ikat. There's something about it. The look of that bleedy edge. I think people have fallen in love with that, for centuries. Yeah.
And isn't that amazing that there's something where it has to be the bleedy edge. If it's too
Yeah.
perfect, it
It's
looks
not, yeah.
printed. And if it's
Yeah.
not perfect enough, you lose the pattern of it. So it's really kind of amazing that I wonder if it's the handmade element of it.
I think it's the handmade element. I think it's the painterly aspect. I always say
Mm-hmm.
that how does a weaver make their work more painterly? They do
hmm
Ikat. I
Yeah.
mean, it has to be a dye process. There's
hmm
nothing on that loom, that gridlock loom, that says, I am painterly. But when you take yarns that have had a painterly hand applied to them,
hmm
and then you put them in and you get this bleedy thing going, all of a sudden you're off the grid. And
Yeah.
that's pretty exciting,
Yeah.
visually, very exciting.
Is this something that you enjoy experiencing as a traveler, as somebody who appreciates weaving, as well as someone who,
Oh, of course.
makes these
Yeah,
tapestries?
of
What's been your
course.
favorite one to explore?
Oh, I mean, all the countries that do Ikat, I have such a fondness, and it's such an excitement, like to go anywhere and discover Ikat
hmm
yardage or anything done in Ikat. I can cite a particular example. I was on a textile trip in China
hmm
a few years ago for the International Ikat and Shibori Conference in Hangzhou, China. And we were doing a bus tour afterwards for a couple of weeks. And we had just gone through the Taklamaman Desert on a bus for days upon end. And all of a sudden we stop at a bus stop, and there is a shop, and it's an Ikat shop in the middle of the desert in China. I've never seen an Ikat shop in my life. And, of course, this is a bus full of textile people. We tear into this shop, and it's not naturally dyed Ikats, but everything has been hand-dyed, hand-woven. There's enough Ikat to dress the world in this little shop. And we went crazy. So that was an unexpected perk in going to China, was to run into an Ikat shop. Where are my favorite Ikats made? I mean, I really have such a love for the Central Asian Ikats. Who doesn't? They're so graphically beautiful. And right now there's this fantastic Ikat exhibit that just opened at the Seattle Art Museum.
Right.
And I haven't seen it yet. I'll be there in a bit to see it. But I'm sure it's full of Central Asian Ikats. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing. I also saw that I believe that Roland and Shinami Ricketts are both doing a piece, and he's really known for a lot of shibori work, but there's a big installation of resist dyed.
Anything either of them put their hand to is off the charts. So this is going to be a fantastic exhibition. Yeah.
Yes. I'm very excited to see it. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to just see it digitally or if I'll get to walk through the galleries myself. But one of the challenging things about textile exhibits this way is that I just want to touch all the things. I want to have them all running through my hand.
Yeah, I think we all do.
Yeah. We should be a little swatch. You should get to pet. And that was one of the things that Convergence.
It's not a bad idea. That's not a bad idea. And I'm going to bear that in mind. I have a show coming up in 2 years, and I'm going to have little swatches under pieces that you could actually touch, particularly the difference between a silk piece and a wool piece, because so many people have no clue. Yeah.
It's true. So what do you find most surprising or most challenging about teaching people to work with Ikat? Because I know that you are an instructor as well as an artist.
Right. That's a really good question. I tell people, be prepared for a level of fussing. You're unaccompanied. You're just not, you haven't done that at a loom. And everyone's like, oh yeah, I got that. No problem. And then we begin and I look over and I see people having a fit because things look so unruly. We're used to these lovely threads right off a spool. Everything's smooth and organized. You warp your loom and away you go. That's not Ikat. In Ikat, you're pulling and shifting threads purposefully to create designs. But anytime you pull, quite a few threads, maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands out of sequence, they create lumps and bumps and tangles and knots.
Right.
And it's not your preferred look in the loom, And everyone goes, what am I doing wrong? Oh my God, what have I done? And I go, no. You are totally right on. I said, now this separates the men from the boys here. Now we have to go in, and manage all this. So much of learning to do Ikat is yarn management.
Right.
Whatever you learned in your beginning weaving class, it sort of doesn't apply anymore. It's like, it looks like every mistake you ever made times 10, all right there at your leash sticks right in front of you. And we always get it organized, but it takes just a level of patience. And some people don't have it. Quite frankly, you're either wired that way or you're not. And I think, I could unravel yarn all day long. I mean, I don't take it personally. And this is another thing. So many people take it personally that their loom looks like a shipwreck mess when they're putting the Ikat on. And I'm like, no. This is how this process looks. And then at the end, the result is so smashing and beautiful. And it was only achieved because we had to take these yarns out of sequence and do odd things with them, put them in bundles and do things with bundles that you never dreamed you would do at your loom.
Yeah.
That's, I like that. And I think when my book first came out, it was during COVID. So of course I wasn't doing online, personal teaching. It was all online. And this last year we've started to meet in person. So I really got to see people's angst up close,
Yeah.
On Zoom. I didn't really, they would tell me about it, but
Right.
I don't know. I was like, yeah, that's fine. You got over it. But when you see it up close, and with a room full of people, I've learned how to walk people through it, I think, with greater skill.
So you're so known for Ikat now. How did you happen to get into this particular field? What led you to a passion for this particular kind of weaving?
That's a very good question. And I think the seeds were planted very early in my life. My first exposure to Ikat, I was probably 3 or 4 years old. And my aunt and uncle had just come back from a trip to Indonesia. My uncle was in the CIA, and he was always going on mystical junkets, here and there. And they would bring back all of these exotic treasures. Mm-hmm. And I think I was probably the only person in 1950 that had Kuba cloth in their bedroom,
Yeah.
I mean, it really stoked my early interest in ethnic objects, I would say. Mm-hmm. But anyway, my aunt brought back a little scrap of Ikat fabric and gave it to me. And I wasn't that wowed by the fabric. When she handed it to me, I was like, oh my gosh, it looked like a handkerchief. But I was wowed by what she then did is she grabbed me by the shoulders and she shook me and she looked me straight in the eyes and she said, Mary, this fabric contains magic. And that was it. I mean, there was not a doubt in my mind when she said that it contained magic.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my God, who has magic cloth? I don't know anyone who does, but I do. And it took me, someplace that I didn't even know existed really. And that cloth went with me everywhere, under my pillow at night, in my pocket, until I finally lost it. But it was a very special object for me. And then years later, when I was in high school, I worked at a bookstore in an old Victorian home. And the owner of the bookstore happened to be, quote unquote, the president of the Fernwood Weavers Guild in Niles, Michigan.
Oh.
And she had this group of women that were so unlike any women I knew. They were not like my mother and my aunts. These were women who were turned on, excited, learning new things, wearing clothes that my mom and my aunts didn't wear, doing things my mom and my aunts didn't do. I mean, I was intoxicated by these women. And one summer they all got in their station wagons and drove to the Michigan League of Hand Weavers conference somewhere in Michigan. And Jacqueline or Larson was the keynote speaker. And he spoke about Ikat. And so they came home and in their tote bags, they started yanking out all of this fabric. And I was like, oh my God, you guys have magic fabric.
That's so wonderful.
And they're like, well, I guess we do, and I was like, oh, and then they told me what it was. I had no idea what it was. I was like, okay, great. File that away. And this is my last little early life story. I was in college. I went to St. Mary's College at Notre Dame, Indiana, which at that time was a sister school to the University of Notre Dame. I was an art major. I was in a portfolio review with the head of the art department, and I'd spread out all my paintings and my prints and my design work. And Sister Rose Ellen looked at everything and she said, Mary, all I'm seeing is textiles. Mm-hmm. These pieces want to be textiles. And I don't think I had ever even said the word textile at that point in my life, let alone entertain the thought that my work was resembling, that my paintings were frustrated textiles. I was floored, and I would say, frankly, a bit insulted. I mean, that wasn't what I wanted to hear out of the portfolio review. And in fact, she said, Mary, I want you to look this up after you leave the review today. On a piece of paper, she wrote down 4 letters. And you know what they were. They were IKAT. Mm-hmm. And she said, look up this technique. And she said, it's not because your work looks like this, but I think as a painter, this is a direction you might want to go. And as I walked out of the room, I remember crumpling up the piece of paper and throwing it in the garbage can, which is terribly passive aggressive. But I was like, no. I don't know what she's talking. She doesn't know what she's talking about. That can't possibly be me, a textile person. What are textiles anyway? And that was that. The seeds had been planted. And my undergrad degree was in photography. My graduate degree was in clay. And I happened to take a weaving class. And the moment I sat behind a loom, that was it. It's like somebody switched a flip. I threw that shuttle in this, and I was making a little thing that was akin to a dish rag. It was nothing of any, any great artistic merit. But as soon as I threw that shuttle, I saw in front of me what the possibilities. I saw the kinds of pieces that I'm making today. And I knew that the road between that dish rag and 20-foot tapestries was going to be a long, circuitous journey. But I was up for it. I was willing to do it. And I started weaving carpets. Once I learned enough to be dangerous, I started weaving carpets and selling them. And pretty quickly felt the gridlock of it. Felt restrained by my lack of great textile prowess and techniques. And I didn't think that my lifetime would be long enough to be a fabulous tapestry weaver. Mm-hmm. So I thought I've got to find solace in a dye pot. And somehow I ended up with a pamphlet on Ikat. And that was probably all that was written at the time. And I just ventured off on my own. And in the little pamphlet, it said, take a board and put a nail at one end and a nail at the other. Stretch some yarn in between, cut up a garbage bag and tie little resist areas and throw it in a dye pot. And that was the sum total of my formal Ikat education right there.
Wow.
I've never studied at the foot of a master.
Right.
I've gone to many countries and certainly seen the work of masters and talked to them, but I've never embarked on that kind of mentorship.
I feel like Ikat was chasing you. It wouldn't let you go.
It wouldn't let me go. And the wonderful thing is that was a pretty quick study. I mean, I was so turned on by the idea of getting off the grid and seeing the results that I just kept taking baby step after baby step. So I think the first I made a little stripe for a carpet that had probably 6 Ikat wraps on it. And to date, the most complicated Ikat I've done, I think, is 186,000 Ikat wraps on a piece. So we've come a long way over the decades. And it was just step by step. The second piece had 12 wraps. Mm-hmm. Then, the next one maybe had 30. It was bit by bit by bit. I kept pushing the envelope to go, what if? What if I tried this? What if I tried that? Oh, I love it. I love it. I love it. I'll try it again. Oh, let's do this. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about going off the grid because at the same time, there is a certain amount of being able to predict what you're doing that strikes me as being almost like playing chess. That you need to be able to say, if I do this, then this is what will happen. And
yeah. And I think the thing with Ikat is there's this incredible focus and accuracy of technique to create a product that looks very whimsical and happenstance. Like, oh, it just happened. Oh, the dye just happened to sweep across the fabric and make this fabulous thing. It wasn't like, oh, yeah, that took 574 hours of wrapping, to get that yarn to, that dye to sweep across the fabric. Mm-hmm. And you either are wired for the level that I do it, you're wired for it or you're not.
Yeah.
My husband refers to it as a damaged chip. And he said, you got a damaged chip, and anyone who works for you in your studio, you all have the same damaged chip that you could sit there and wrap yarn hour after hour, day after day. And we do. But it's not because we're so crazy about wrapping yarn, but we are completely nuts about the results.
Yeah.
It's so worth it. It's like dieting or something,
Well, I was going to say that's exactly how a functional chip works. It does a whole bunch of tiny little minute calculations and it persists and you come up with something that you follow to its next, conclusion.
I say that life has compromises, and the only way I'm going to get from A to the letter Q is to do this, 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 and this. And I know how to do it, and the formula works, and it's really fun.
It's interesting that you talk about how some of this came out of a portfolio review, because one of the decisions that artists often make is, to what extent do I want to be figurative versus more expressive, maybe, or abstract? And I feel like in Ikat, that almost comes into play more than some of the complex weave structures and things like that. You can decide, am I going to play with color and pattern? Am I going to try to make a figure, which is what a lot of the traditional Ikat patterns do? So how did you match up your kind of artistic interests with what you wanted to make your textiles look like?
Okay, really, really good question. And this is what I always say to students. Not every idea was meant to be Ikat. Mm-hmm. It's first of all, there's this moment of discernment when you go, oh, this would be a real good double weave, or oh, this would make a great slit tapestry, or this is just a bad idea in general. Or this is a perfect idea for an Ikat. So it's understanding what the strengths and weaknesses of the technique and what they will bring out. And I think for me, as I've worked over the years, I learned to weave just like everybody. It's developmental. We all make the same stuff when we're starting out. And so, I didn't jump from overshot to Ikat overnight. My work started, especially my carpets and tapestries, I started doing large, big, color saturated blocks. And, always aiming for is to make it more painterly, to make it more painterly, to make it more painterly. So I became pretty crazy about the juxtaposition of the feathered edge with a slit tapestry hard edge. So my work has both qualities in it now. The pieces that I'm doing these days are I do a lot of hard edge color blocks with Ikat inserts. And there's a really nice play of tension between the two edges. And I don't know if I've answered your question about how do you know how to apply your ideas. A few years ago, and I guess I can digress a bit with another story. Right when COVID hit and, the world shut down, all of a sudden I'm sitting in my studio, and I have at that time 2 studio assistants. And I'm like, I am determined to keep them employed.
Yeah.
But, things had stopped flowing our way. And so I had been thinking for years about doing a really huge Ikat landscape. And what I wanted to capture was the sandhill crane bird migration on the Platte River in February in Nebraska. We have a world-class bird migration. The people come from all over the world to watch 1 million birds land on the Platte River, and they're there for quite a few weeks. And I found a bird's eye image of a long stretch of the river with the cranes roosting on it. And the minute I saw it, I was like, that's it. That's an Ikat. And it's going to be done, and it's going to be dyed all in indigo. It's going to be all blue and white. It's going to be like 18 feet wide and 30 inches high. It's going to be this huge wall of birds, like you would put in a long hallway in a nature center or something like that. Sure. And so I did it. I got permission to use the photo. And we worked on that almost the first year of COVID in my studio. And it was just jillions of hours of wrapping. And it came out beautifully. And it's just blue and white. It's not typical of my normal work. This was a moment when Ikat was the perfect solution for telling a story. Yeah. And the story looks very timeless. Wow. So that was exciting, and it's made me want to do more. I want to embark on more of these big landscape things. Yeah. And
you said that you basically have sort of learned through trial and error how to go from, I'm just going to have a little dyed blip here, to something where you can evoke, a whole photograph or something like that.
Right.
And is that all just something you've done through trial and error?
Yeah. But I think also, this goes back to one of your earlier questions about how do you see yourself as an artist. Right. I think I had so much really excellent art background. I had some very amazing painting professors, and I was taught a lot. A lot of people poured a lot into me, and it came out in the name of textiles, And so all of that has been pretty invaluable, all that background. And it's also gave me courage. I think that was another thing. When I left college, there was not a doubt in my mind that I was an artist.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that. Somebody convinced me of that. Who? I don't know. And there wasn't a doubt in my mind that this was a lifetime path, that I, whatever making it is,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that that word is. I think part of making it is just loving what you do.
Sure.
And to keep pushing the envelope and pushing the envelope and pushing the envelope. But I knew that it wasn't like a 5-year gig.
Right.
And then I was going to go and become a massage therapist or something,
Right.
that this is who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a pretty great journey. And I just keep always saying, oh, I feel like we're just getting down to it now.
Yeah.
I'm just getting started,
Uh-huh.
just getting started. Oh, I've got this idea. Oh, I'm just at the beginning here. And I'm not at the beginning, for Pete's sake, but I have the excitement of feeling that I'm just at the beginning. And that's a blessing.
Sure.
To be constantly fed and excited by making work.
And if you're, inspired by new ideas and new scales of working, you're constantly just at the beginning of whatever the next step is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's always new levels of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I like that what if challenge. Yeah. And I think, somebody says, and I don't know who it was that said that so much of being an Ikat weaver requires you to be an engineer. And I would agree with that. And I think a lot of weavers are engineers as well. We are always being asked to dip into that side of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And it requires some skill sets that perhaps other art forms don't embody.
Yeah. Well, you're problem solving, whether it's an engineering problem or an artistic problem. Certainly with textiles, you're thinking about things like tensile strength and twist and all those sorts of material science elements of it. But you're dealing with a set of problems, and how successfully you solve them determines how good is you are as an artist and an engineer.
And I think, and you're building something. You're building a piece of cloth, and you're literally building it thread by thread by thread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you're making something out of nothing, and that's pretty exciting.
Mm-hmm. Are you attracted by other elements of, making cloth thread by thread, or is it pretty much an artistic pursuit for you? So, for example, do you say, I'm just going to sit in front of the television and do some knitting or, weave on a pin loom? Or is it sort of like, this is your studio practice and making textiles is sort of your major outlet?
Right. That's another great question. You have really good questions. And I will start by saying what I tell all of my classes. First 5 minutes out of the hatch, I say, I am not a weaver's weaver. Mm-hmm. That's somebody else. And we all know who they are. We could run a list of those people that they know everything about weaving and they do it all the time. And I'm not that person. My bandwidth is very deep, but it's very narrow. It's not this long horizontal bandwidth where I have shadow weave at one end and crackle weave at the other and Ikat's in the middle. Mm-hmm. That's not me at all. Maybe I years ago, I did one project of all of those things, learning to weave. Do I have a great love of cloth? Yes. And an appreciation for the making of that and all of those people who do it? You bet I do. And it was renewed, actually. This last fall, I taught the 6-week textile concentration, fall textile concentration at Penland School of Craft mm-hmm. in Penland, North Carolina. And I taught a class called the Ikat Portfolio. And it was 6 weeks, day and night, 6 weeks. And I had 12 students in the class. And in those 6 weeks, those 12 wonderful, talented students made me fall in love with cloth again and again and again and again. And they all came with different skill sets. Who knows who's going to be in your class? Mm-hmm. But the things they made, the cloth they produced was so exquisite and so labored over and inspiring. And I came out of that experience knowing that I would write another book on Ikat, going into directions that I hadn't gone in the first book, and really honoring and celebrating handwoven cloth. I had a profoundly spiritual experience at Penland.
That's wonderful.
As an instructor, besides being exhausted, it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun, and it was a beautiful moment when I was like, oh my gosh, I love cloth.
So you mentioned that your weaving interests are very narrow and deep in Ikat. But your first book was for a broad audience of weavers. Is that right?
Yeah.
How did you write your book knowing that people who might weave from it are folks who might practice a whole different kind of structure, et cetera?
Well, the point of the book was to teach a technique and then encourage people to apply it to what already is their signature trademark style of weaving. And at that time, I had several studio assistants that were fairly new weavers. And so they were perfect helpers on this because they didn't know much about using the technique in a warp application. So we were able to problem solve about all kinds of really basic things. And I knew that I had to make the teaching of the technique as broad a bandwidth as possible. That basically this is how it's been done in a lot of different countries. This is how you basically do it. Now you go and apply it and you get wild and crazy with it. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing for me on this book, the book came out, people started buying it and weaving off of it. And I am constantly getting emails from people with images of pieces that they have woven as a result of the book. And it's pretty exciting to see that, it's working. It's like, yeah, they got it. They got it. And oh my God, this person just wove 32 yards of Ikat fabric. And in fact, they're standing on the third floor of their house and it's rolled out the window and the bottom of the fabric is in their front yard, I mean, just all the different applications. And I realized that, that's all everybody needed was just an angle in to a technique so it didn't seem as incredibly intimidating. And like, oh, I can't do that. Of course you can. And you can if somebody holds your hands and says, oh, just, step one, you do this. Step two, you do this. And so the book starts out very developmentally, very, very simple. And then each project teaches one more skill set and one more skill set.
Because teaching someone to do the basic skills of Ikat is so different from working at a master level to create a piece of art. I think sometimes it can be challenging for people to sort of flick that switch, and especially if it's somebody who's not sitting in front of you, anticipate their questions.
When Interweave Press asked me to do the book, they said, nothing's been written in Ikat forever. Would you consider doing a book? And they said, and it must be a technique book. I was always going to do a coffee table book. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, man, I don't know about that. I said, I know it can't be totally weft-based. And I thought a while and I said, yes, I'll do it. So on a certain level, it brought me to my knees, but, only briefly. Once I got going, and at the end of the book, I said, oh, now I know how to write a book.
Yes.
Because at the beginning, you don't, like right, everything,
absolutely.
You're just stumbling along, in a cold sweat. Going, I don't know about this, but it all worked out.
So what's the next book that you're working on?
The next book is I would say a companion to this book. And we're going to go deeper, many different types of projects and building on skill sets. So, the first book is not a requirement to do things in the second book. Of course, I have to repeat some things, but I just want to take people to a deeper level and offer some tips on skill sets at a deeper level. And also there was a lot that I feel like that didn't get said in the first book. And after teaching off of the first book, I saw where there were certain holes in the teaching. Where I was like, okay, we should have added this, or I should have said it this way. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to say it this way in this book.
Yeah.
And also, it's just fun. I like to write. I'm very I'm just interested in producing. I don't know that there's going to be a shelf full of these books. It might end with 2, but I definitely am motivated to do this.
That's so exciting. I feel like there's a moment for Ikat, and maybe it's just that anytime that you become personally interested in something, it feels like all of a sudden it's everywhere. I feel that way. With your books, and then with this exhibit in Seattle, which is so exciting. It's got these huge cultural traditions and also contemporary art elements to it. And it just feels like an exciting time for Ikat.
I agree. And when I started doing Ikat, it wasn't even a household word among weavers, and now it's such a dominant force in the home interior industry. Ikat fabrics are, they're coveted, they're beautiful, they're silk, they're made in Uzbekistan, they're very expensive. and they can't keep them in stock. So it's having a moment for sure. I think before this incarnation is over, I do want to do a big Uzbek-inspired robe, a big wearable piece.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
So that's on my to-do list. But before that, there'll be lots of things for this book. Like among the projects in this book, we're going into a little bit. We're going to incorporate a bit of sewing and do some pretty fun projects like Ikat aprons. And I'm a fan of aprons, so I want to do a whole series of Ikat aprons.
The trouble with sewing with fabric is that it often involves cutting, and as difficult as it might be to cut your regular hand-woven fabric, I can't imagine how terrifying it would be to cut your
Ikat. Well, then we have another project of what to do with those scraps, so you don't waste 1 inch of it.
That's good. Yeah. It's interesting that we talked about the word Ikat and how it has a particular regional sense. And then, you use the word shibori, and of course that's Japanese. So do you think it's just that that's where it's most famous? Is it because...
Yeah. I think that. I really do. I think the word Ikat comes from an Indonesian word, mengikat, mengikat. And the word is a noun and a verb. The verb means to tie or bind. And the noun means a wrap or a knot. So you put them together and you have it completely describes the process. You're wrapping, I guess it doesn't have the word yarn in it, but you are wrapping and creating a resist with a knot.
And then, the word jaspe is often just means like heathered, but that's a word I see in textiles a lot, even though it means a particular technique from a particular place that,
right.
Guatemalan
Ikat. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Guatemalan textiles have such a distinctive look. That striping pattern, that holds through in all of their cloth. It's very distinct, and it's parts of it have little teeny flecks that were achieved through Ikat wrapping. It's quite amazing. Yeah.
And then, those textiles often there'll be a warp and a weft, and it's like they just run roughshod over each other. It's like the warp and the weft aren't talking. They both have distinct patterns, but they don't relate to each other. But then the pochampally, that's how you pronounce it, the saris in India, which are double Ikat, and those create a distinct pattern where they overlap because it's almost more like a plaid where they're trying to get a square, for example, that it's trying to be something where the warp and the weft interact.
Right. There's calculated Ikat, which is called double Ikat, and the non-calculated, the random, is called compound Ikat. Technically, if you were going to compare the two. And, and both are pretty fabulous. I mean, quite a technical feat when the warp and weft combine and fill out a beautiful picture or story. But it's not a requirement.
And then often at the very edges, you'll see the little bits where somebody just zhuzhed it just a little bit.
Yeah.
Twisted up the tail and stuck it in the shed.
That's a great description of what you do. And that's part of the fussing. So you fuss when you're wrapping the Ikat, and then you fuss when you're weaving the Ikat to get things to fit. And I teach all kinds of this, a 1,000,001 tricks. And I always tell my weavers, I said, when you sit down at the loom to weave Ikat, everything your beginning weaving teacher taught you, you disregard. About bubbling and, all we care about is getting the Ikat to fit and making it look fabulous. And we don't care how we get there, And so I teach them all kinds of ways to break the rules and make Ikat fit.
You're very goal-oriented.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
The Ikat rules, always.
Yes, absolutely. So this has been such an interesting deep dive into Ikat and a little bit of a shallow dive into your process. But if somebody was interested in learning more about how you do your work and about Ikat in general, how would they find those opportunities?
What I suggest is going to my website, maryzicafoose.com. I keep an updated teaching calendar on my website. So you could contact any of the art centers or guilds to see if there are vacancies in those workshops. But even better, I would say, is that when I'm invited somewhere, I pretty much always say yes. If you invite me, I will come. I will come. I really will. If there's an interest, I am there. And so if your guild or your study group or your art center is interested in learning Ikat, just contact me. I teach over Zoom as well as in-person workshops. And they fill up. It's not that difficult to get me in the guest bedroom at your house. I'll be there in a minute.
Well, in addition to finding classes on your website, you have some beautiful images of all of your different kinds of projects. So there's a bit of you can go and see what you've been working on as well as where they could find you.
Yeah, I try to keep my gallery updated. And in terms of what's happening in the studio right now, I haven't really talked too much about my current work. I always have a running, blessedly, and thank goodness I have a running list of commissions that I'm always chasing after. I'm always behind, it seems. But people contact me to commission work for their homes as well as for public buildings. And those are usually quite involved, really fun to do, quite time consuming, but delightful, really. So we're working on a series of those as well as a year of projects for the new book. So when I say we, right now, I have one studio assistant. His name is Peyton Pearson. He's been with me a year and a half. And at Christmas, I lost my old longtime studio assistant, Anna Nance, who'd been with me for 14 years.
Oh, wow.
So that was like losing my daughter. She came to me right out of undergraduate school. She went to Savannah College of Art and Design in textiles, stayed with me 14 years, and just had her first baby. So she's home. She's home being a mama. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you lost her to another exciting project.
Cause. Right.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think probably wrapping Ikat looks pretty easy compared to what she's doing now.
I think so. Certainly a lot tidier. No dye pot can keep up with the baby.
with a new baby. Oh my goodness.
Well, Mary Zicafoose, thank you so much for your time, and I can't wait to see what you come up with next.
Well, thank you for having me. I love to talk to weavers. I love to talk about Ikat, but I think we all like to talk about ourselves and our work. So this was, a great opportunity for me to get all that off my chest. So thank you so much.
Thanks to Trinway Silks for sponsoring this episode. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.